Imagine losing your baby not once, but twice, and then being told it's your fault, and that you are a murderer, and that your grief was a lie. This is the story of Sally Clarke, a devoted mother, a solicitor, a woman who trusted the justice system, only to be destroyed by it. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel for another true crime deep dive with a legal twist. Today we're delving into one of the most haunting miscarriages of justice in UK history, where flawed science and withheld evidence collided to ruin a life. This is a story that should never have happened, and once you hear it, you won't forget it, because it's a tragic collision of flawed statistics, suppressed medical evidence, and institutional blind spots. And the consequences were devastating. Not only the loss of her children, but the relentless psychological toll that ultimately led to Sally's death. Let's begin at the start of this unimaginable ordeal. On September 26, 1996, Sally and Steve Clarke welcomed their first child, Christopher. He was born healthy and was very much adored by his parents. By all accounts, Sally was absolutely thrilled to be a mother. For 11 weeks, life was filled with the usual chores and the joy of having a newborn in their home. But everything changed on the night of December 13, 1996. Sally was at home with Christopher while Steve attended an office party, and at some point during the evening, Sally walked into Christopher's room, maybe to check on him, maybe just out of pure instinct, but what she found shattered her world in a single breath. Her baby boy wasn't breathing, his tiny body was still. At 9:35 p.m, Sally called for an ambulance, and then she waited. Every minute must have stretched on like an eternity. There was nothing she could do but hope that the paramedics could save her little boy. As the paramedics stepped through the door, Sally must have felt lost in a blur of fear and confusion, desperate for answers and desperate for help. And then at 10:40 p.m, Christopher was officially declared dead. The paramedics later testified that he had turned cyanotic, or was blue, and this is an indication of oxygen deprivation, which had occurred long before their arrival. A post-mortem was carried out by Dr. Williams, a Home Office pathologist. He found a few bruises, including a small tear and bruise on the frenulum. He believed these were caused during frantic resuscitation efforts. He also found signs of infection in Christopher's lungs and thought that he may have had a lower respiratory tract infection. In the end, Dr. Williams concluded that Christopher died of sudden infant death syndrome. This left Sally dealing with the devastation of having lost a son. She received counselling for postnatal depression, and by the time their second son, Harry, was born, she was reportedly recovered. And then in November 1997, after all the heartbreak they'd already endured, Sally and Steve Clarke welcomed another baby boy into their world, Harry. He arrived 3 weeks early, he was healthy, and there were no signs pointing in the wrong direction. Sally and Steve took part in the Care of Next Infant program. This is a support initiative for parents who lost a child to SIDS. They were doing everything right, everything they could do to get themselves back on track. But tragedy struck again on January 26, 1998, just months after Harry's birth. It was a regular evening like any other. Sally and Steve were home together, and around 8:10 p.m, Steve stepped away to make a bottle for Harry. In those few short minutes, Harry suddenly became unwell. Sally called out for Steve and then called for help. The emergency service arrived just after 9:30 p.m. The paramedics arrived at a scene which would have mirrored a mother's worst nightmare. Sally was on the bedroom floor, cradling Harry. Her voice at this stage must have been shaking with fear, as her hands were trying to revive a baby already gone. It was happening again. Another child, and another desperate call, and another unthinkable loss. One no mother should ever have to live. It was a nightmarish deja vu, and despite all efforts, Harry showed no signs of life. He was pronounced dead at 9:41 p.m, and for Sally, that single night would mark the beginning of a long and devastating ordeal. Once again, the post-mortem was carried out by Dr. Williams, but this time he reached a different conclusion. What he found disturbed him, signs of injury that, in his view, couldn't be explained by an accident. He believed that the physical signs pointed to repeated episodes of shaking, not just once, but over several days. And based on those findings, he concluded that Harry's death had likely been caused by non-accidental shaking. This caused Dr. Williams to think again about his other findings, and he began to re-examine the circumstances surrounding the death of Christopher, Steve and Sally's first son. He revisited the retained materials and brought in other experts for a second opinion, and in doing so, he reached a new devastating conclusion, that Christopher's death had not been caused by natural causes. There were signs, all but subtle, but nonetheless present, that Christopher had died of smothering. On February 23, 1998, Sally and Steve were arrested on the suspicion of murdering Harry. The following day, Sally gave a detailed interview, walking investigators through everything she could remember. She insisted she never harmed Harry in any way, but the pressure from the police did not let up. Weeks later, the focus shifted, and on April 9th, Sally was re-interviewed, this time accused of killing Christopher. She declined to answer questions on the advice of her solicitor, and again in July she was brought in for further questioning, and she refused to speak on the advice of legal counsel. Yet the silence, which was legally advised, was twisted into something far more sinister, because in the next interview on July 2nd, the walls weren't just collapsing in, they were collapsing around Sally. Her grief was reframed as guilt, and the silence her solicitor advised was twisted into the presumption of harm. A mother who had already buried 2 sons was now being painted as their killer. Ultimately, Sally was charged with murder of both her sons, while the case against her husband Steve was dropped. Sally Clarke has always denied the charges brought against her, and was supported throughout this ordeal by her husband Steve. During the court proceedings, she gave birth to a 3rd son, but what the jury didn't know was that key medical evidence, the evidence that could have changed everything, was kept from them. In today's case, we're going to show how this case became one of the most unforgivable miscarriages of justice in the history of the UK. To really understand how jarring this case was, we need to understand who Sally Clarke really was. Born Sally Lockyer in Wiltshire, she was the daughter of a police officer and a hairdresser. She was bright, ambitious, and she studied geography at the University of Southampton. After graduating, she jumped into the world of finance, first with Lloyds Bank as a management trainee, and then later with Citibank. But life took a turn in 1990 when she married solicitor Steve Clarke. Not long after, Sally made the bold decision to switch careers, leaving behind her job in the City of London to follow Steve into law. She studied at the University of London, trained at a respected law firm, Macfarlane's, and eventually moved with Steve to Manchester in 1994, where they both joined Addleshaw, Booth and Co. The couple settled into their new life in Cheshire, a place where they hoped to grow their family and their future together. Sally Clarke wasn't just a mother, she was a well-educated, career-driven and conscientious professional. So what exactly did the prosecution rely on? Well, let's break down the core pillars of their case. Christopher and Harry came into the world just over a year apart, but heartbreakingly, they died even closer together. Christopher was just 11 weeks old, while Harry was 8. The timing of their deaths, the prosecution argued, was an indication of foul play. So what did the Court of Appeal make of this? Well, they saw it for what it was. 2 babies, both still in that vulnerable window of life. Their unexplained deaths could have been explained by complications that aren't so rare. Although the court thought that medical science doesn't always have the answers, Developmental fragility, hidden conditions, these are the things that can happen, and tragically without warning. So drawing conclusions just based on their age and timing of death at 8 and 11 weeks isn't just simplistic, it's reckless. And yet the idea of the timings alone pointed to something deliberate became a central part of the prosecution's case. The prosecution also pointed to the fact that the boys died around the same time of night, shortly after a feed, always when Sally was alone with them. That detail was treated as suspicious, but in reality it's quite normal. The Court of Appeal dismissed this as a coincidence. Also, newborn routines often follow a pattern. Feeding at 8 or 9 p.m. isn't suspicious in itself and is actually quite typical. There's nothing strange or incriminating about that. The prosecution also pointed out that Steve Clarke, Sally's husband, wasn't home. He was out at a work event when Christopher died and was due to travel the day after Harry passed. They hinted that this was significant, but as the Court of Appeal made clear, family life is full of minor coincidences. Unless there's solid evidence that Sally was somehow distressed by her husband's absence, and there wasn't, this line of argument was pure speculation, and speculation shouldn't be the basis of a murder charge. The third argument was all about timing. The prosecutor said that both babies were found unresponsive around 9:30 p.m, shortly after what they describe as a successful feed. They treated this as more coincidence, as if showing a repeating pattern. But when the Court of Appeal took a closer look, they found nothing to support that claim. Harry, for example, the jury was told, vomited before his death, which seemed to support the idea he had just eaten. But what they weren't told, and this is crucial, is that the post-mortem found no evidence of a recent feed. None. And that's not a small omission. It completely undermines the entire successful feed theory, and yet, for reasons no one could adequately explain, the jury never heard this key piece of medical evidence. In fact, the idea that Harry had just eaten before his death was contradicted by a post-mortem, and no milk was found in his stomach. That is a major omission, and the jury was never told about it. The appeal court also found this striking omission, especially considering how much the prosecution leaned on the feeding timeline event in their appeal documents. But when you put all the evidence together, not just what Sally believed, what happened, it becomes clear that the timings don't prove anything. The most serious claim from the prosecution was that both babies had been previously injured. The prosecution argued that both boys showed signs of previous abuse and that each had been injured before their death. But when the Court of Appeal reviewed all the evidence, they found no signs of abuse. No doctors, no nurses, no family friends ever raised any concerns. There were no bruises, there were no warning signs, and there was no history of harm. If anything, the evidence showed the opposite, that Christopher and Harry were thriving, they were well cared for, and deeply loved by both their parents. So, what was the case actually built on? In the end, it came down to one crucial thing, a medical opinion, specifically the pathologist's assessment. And that's why it was so important to scrutinise every detail in this case, because when a mother's guilt rests entirely on one interpretation, one expert opinion, you have to be absolutely certain the evidence is rock solid. There were people, her husband included, who simply could not believe Sally had killed her children. That idea never sat right with them in the first place, and they just didn't hold on to one hope quietly. They kept pushing, fighting to prove that the convictions were wrong. Sally Clarke spent more than 3 years behind bars before the Court of Appeal finally quashed her conviction in 2003. Sally Clarke had not caused the death of her two sons, Christopher and Harry. They had both died of natural causes, and yet the majority of the case was based on a single medical opinion by Dr. Williams. So what went terribly wrong, and how did the justice system fail so catastrophically? Because the consequences of that first judgment weren't just legal. They were deeply personal and devastating for Sally Clarke and her family. A big part of the answer lies here within the withheld microbiology reports, vital medical evidence that was never disclosed at trial. But all this need not have happened, simply because of the improper handling of the microbiology reports by Dr. Alan Williams. So what really happened? Well, let's start with Christopher, Sally and Steve's first son. His blood and urine tests came back fine. No signs of infection. The lab did detect Streptococcus aureus in his nose and throat, but that finding was drowned out by the forensic claims of smothering or shaking. And now let's talk about Sally and Steve's second son, Harry. In many ways, the microbiology findings in his case were even more significant, because during the post-mortem, samples taken from Harry revealed a Streptococcus aureus infection in several places: his lungs, his bronchi, trachea, throat, stomach wall, and even in his cerebral spine fluid. And that's the fluid that cushions your brain and spine, and it's supposed to be completely sterile, but what the experts found was bacteria and white blood cells fighting an infection. And this pointed to something far more serious. Harry had a real infection while he was alive, and leading professionals like Professor James Morris and retired pathologist Glenn Walters reviewed the evidence and said it pointed clearly to a systemic infection. In other words, Harry had likely died of natural causes and not abuse. And here's the most shocking part. Dr. Williams' official post-mortem report stated there was no evidence of acute infection and no evidence that this child had died as a result of natural causes. Even worse, those vital microbiology results were not shared with either the defence or the prosecution, not until after Sally's first appeal. If those microbiology reports had been disclosed at trial, it's unlikely Sally Clarke would have been convicted at all. In fact, it's doubtful charges would have been brought against her in the first place. Now let's talk about those infamous statistics that were put in front of the jury, 1 in 73 million. One of the key prosecution witnesses in the Sally Clarke trial was Professor Roy Meadow. He told the jury that the odds of 2 natural cot deaths happening in a family like the Clarkes, affluence and non-smoking, were 1 in 73 million. That statistic became a cornerstone of the case against her and was deeply flawed. It assumes the deaths were independent, which they were not. In fact, losing one child to SIDS increases the risk of another such tragedy, not the opposite way around. And significantly, the judge never properly questioned whether that kind of statistical evidence should have been allowed at all. Do you think this would have actually helped the jury to understand the case? Because that's the real problem here. The numbers were baked in with some dangerous assumptions. The jury was supposed to assess each child's death separately, but the 1 in 73 million figure lumped them together, as if both deaths were one suspicious package. It implied 2 cot deaths in one family. Well, that's basically impossible. Can you imagine being in the courtroom knowing your baby died of natural causes and hearing a statistic used to call you a murderer? But here's the catch. If the jury believed even one of the deaths wasn't due to SIDS, then the odds of the other being a SIDS case dropped to 1 in 8,543, and suddenly the dramatic 1 in 73 million number becomes completely irrelevant. And even that 1 in 8,543 figure still doesn't help the jury to decide whether this case is one of those rare events. Juries already know that cot deaths are very rare. They don't need a statistic to tell them that. Medical research has shown things like genetics, environment and family history all play a role in SIDS. So if one baby in a family dies from SIDS, the truth of it all is that the risk of it happening again actually goes up and not down. But what the jury do need to know that helps them to understand is what actually happened to the babies, not a bunch of numbers. Because when you tell a jury that 2 deaths in one family happen only once in a century, you're basically saying this must be murder. And that's not justice, because that's math masquerading as certainty. If this had happened to your sister or your daughter or your friend, what would you have wanted the justice system to do? And now let's return to Sally Clarke, because she didn't just lose her sons, she lost her name, her career and her sanity. She was called a murderer and was locked in a prison where child killers are marked forever. And all the while, the truth sat buried in a folder. Hidden medical evidence that could have saved her, and when the system admitted its mistake, she was never saved from the trauma of being wrongfully accused. Her family said she was never truly recovered from what she had been through, and after her release, her husband heartbreakingly shares that she'll never be well again. A family spokesperson explained that the false accusations, built on flawed medical evidence, compounded by the failures in the legal system, shattered everything Sally had believed in, including the very justice system she once served. The toll was overwhelming, and during the later inquest, it was revealed that Sally had been diagnosed with several severe psychiatric conditions, including enduring personality changes after this catastrophic trauma and prolonged grief and alcohol dependency. The Sally Clarke case exposed bad science, overreach by the prosecution, and broken legal safeguards, which converged to destroy a life. And in Sally's case, this wasn't a system that made a mistake, it was a system that refused to see it, refused to listen, and in doing so, it cost a woman her freedom and finally her life. And then on the 16th of March 2007, Sally was found dead at her home in Hatfield, Essex. At first it was thought that she had died of natural causes, but the inquest later confirmed she had died of acute alcohol intoxication. The coroner made it clear there was no evidence that Sally Clarke intended to take her life. And eventually in 2003, the Court of Appeal quashed Sally's convictions. The evidence had failed her, as did the experts. The system had also failed her, but justice delayed is still injustice, and by the time the truth came out, Sally was no longer the woman she once was. She had been broken by lies and by arrogance and by a system too proud to admit it was wrong. She came out of prison, but she never came back to life. Sally had spent more than 3 years in prison and was branded a killer. She came from a legal background, she was the daughter of a police officer, and that made her a target of other inmates. Sally never recovered, but there was, in the end, some justice. Professor Roy Meadows' misuse of statistics wasn't just an error, because after Sally's release, his credibility collapsed. In 2005, he was struck off the General Medical Council's register for serious misconduct, although that decision was later overturned on appeal. But Sally wasn't the only mother affected by Meadows' flawed testimony. He also gave evidence in the case of Angela Cannings, Tripti Patel and Donna Anthony, all who were wrongfully convicted based on Dr. Meadows' evidence and who were later exonerated. And then, of course, there's Dr. Alan Williams, the Home Office pathologist who conducted the post-mortems on both Sally's son. In June 2005, he was banned from carrying out Home Office and coroner's work for 3 years after being found guilty of serious professional misconduct in the Sally Clarke case. Other experts openly criticised his handling of the evidence, and the judge at Sally's second appeal didn't hold back either. Williams was given the opportunity to explain why he withheld the microbiology results, and he declined. If this story moved you and you believe in justice built on truth, please like, share and subscribe. The more we understand about these failures, the better chance we have of preventing them. Until next time, take care.